Westmeath Field Names project has been on the go now for 5 years. I never thought when we started that we were still going after 5 years, and we're still finding interesting names all the time. 2020 and 21 were difficult, but we kept going and we still did a bit of work. So I'll get into maybe a bit more of the detail about the project, what it's about, what we've done so far, how we do it, and then I'm going to look in detail about some names we've collected recently, most of which are relatively local to here, a few from a little bit further afield in the county. So about 2,350 names. I say about because sometimes we collect the same name twice and one was minor, kind of duplicates and things like that. It's around about that, which is a fair amount of names. Now, how many fields are in Westmeath, I don't know, a massive multiple of that figure, but still it's a good sample nonetheless. About 130 people have been involved as volunteers. It's a volunteer-based project, community-based project. We usually match up with a local community group, acquire a community group, and set them up to go collecting field names in their own area. 14 community groups have been involved to date in different parts of the county, and sometimes I also go out and interview people individually and collect names that way. Particularly during COVID, I did a little bit of that, and it was difficult to have meetings. Very important to mention the very important funding from the Heritage Council and Westmeath County Council, and in the past 1 year we had some funding from Creative Ireland as well. And see Melanie McQuaid is here, and without Melanie the project never would have got off the ground really, and has supported us from the very beginning and continues to support us. I'm my own background, I'm a lecturer in Irish at the University of Limerick. I have a PhD on townland names in County Westmeath, so I just looked at names around Tubberclare, Drumraney, that sort of area for my PhD, and that's where my interest began in place names as well. That's where I developed my interest. My interest probably went back to childhood really, being at Mass and maybe being a bit bored, and being more interested in what the priest used to mention at the end when we talked about the coming week where he'd be visiting sick people and so on, the house calls, and he'd read out all the townlands. And that just fascinated me, you know, the names. So that's probably how my interest began. I was lucky enough that there was funding available from the Department of Arts, Heritage and the Belt as it was at the time. It gave me 4 years to look at townland names. When I was collecting the townland names, I realised that there was a lot of field names, undocumented field names. I was out talking to people locally, getting the local pronunciation of townland names, and then sometimes they'd mention a few field names to me as well. So it was something I wanted to come back to, and eventually, a few years later, I did get back to. Talking about community groups, because it's local people, local communities, local farmers who actually do the vast majority of the collection themselves. So we had, I think, one meeting in Loughnane Valley with Topman and Drumraney, Ballymore being very active, Tang, Rochford Bridge, Kinnegad, Cool, Collinstown, Fore, Multifarnham, Mount Temple, Rosemount, Boher this year, so that's a very good spread all over the county. And then individuals I've talked to, mostly within kind of range of my own area, Lissahaven, Killinure, Washtown, Glenwood, Carrick O'Brien just south of Athlone, Kilcornan, it's kind of Tang, Drumraney and a few other areas there as well. Now, how does it work and what happens to the information? That's one of the first questions people ask me at the meetings, what happens to all this information? And a very important part of the project is documentation and making these names, how would I say, revitalising, I think was the word I used back at the very start, broadening the currency of these names. A lot of minor place names, which is kind of unfortunate term, but what it means essentially is names that are not part of the administrative system. So townland names are a part of the administrative system. They're on your address. If you're unfortunate enough to get penalty points or something, it'll be the townland that's there. They're an important part of that, and they're very well documented as a result. Field names and names of small streams, woods, bogs, some of them are on maps, but the vast majority are undocumented. They're outside of that administrative tradition. Sometimes, in the case of field names in particular, one or two or maybe a handful of people might know these names. So by documenting them, mapping them, putting them online, you make them available to a much broader range of people. And that has a whole range of benefits. The names are more likely to survive, but also people get kind of more of an appreciation of the window of their own area. And that could be useful for all sorts of reasons. You know, I'm even thinking of especially urban areas where you have problems with how to name housing developments and so on. If we can actually document their names that are there, we can be more informed in the choices we make for new names and so on. So what happens is they're uploaded onto a website called mehel-loganim.ie. So some of you may have heard of loganim.ie. This is the national database of place names. That's for the administrative names, parishes, baronies, towns, villages and townlands. There's 100,000 names in that database. Very useful for journalists, for anybody working in administration, anything like that. Mehel-Loganim then is a sort of side project to Loganim, and what it is a website where you can go on and log place names, local place names which are not in the name database. And it has a mapping interface, and you can go in there and you can put the name into the database directly yourself. So what we do then is we record on paper. We found in practice it was easier to record on paper at the meetings, and then at the end of the year usually we'll upload the names onto the website. We also do a little bit of analysis on the names, and we've published 2 10-page booklets explaining a selection of the names, what they mean, their significance, and so on. Interesting aspects of their linguistic development and so on, especially the Irish names. We're active on Twitter as well. Sometimes after a meeting is over, I'll analyse 3 or 4 place names that we collected in the meeting, have a look at the landscape, what they described there, and so on. Briefly look at the website itself, what it looks like. I can honestly important that it's there, that there's a national government funded platform to record the names, and once the data is in there over time they will develop it and make it easier to search it and so on. If you get used to it you can usually find what you're looking for. As I said, individuals can put names there, or groups can upload names kind of en masse. You can put up a couple of 100 names. What you see is when you go in and you look at the map, there's these little blue pins, and each one of them is a name, and if you highlight or click on the pin then you get a little box with the name and some other information. Sometimes the pronunciation, sometimes maybe an explanation or some background on the name, it varies. So that's Mehel-Loganim. We have our own website as well where you can download these 2 booklets. Okay, so you can download them as PDFs. And also, very importantly, our record sheet. So I'll talk a little bit now about how we actually go about recording the names, in case there's anyone here interested in recording names in their own area. So we operate a paper-based system. So we have a numbered map. We use the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps of around 1912, 13, 14 for County Westmeath. So from about 100 years ago. And usually they're very close to the field boundaries as there were in the 20th century. Okay, and there's been a lot of changes maybe since the 1960s, but people would often remember the way it was before that, so they're a very good match for people's memories. And we number each field, and then the record sheet's very simple. Numbers on the left, the name and the next column, and the landowner or the source of the information and their details, townland by townland. So it's a very, very simple system. That's how it works. If anyone has any questions just about that system, go ahead, I don't mind.
So, quick one. Do the names change maybe over time? Is it something that's like someone called it years ago, or would it be something
They do, definitely, yeah. There's a lot of variation there. If a farm gets sold, there's a high chance of names being lost and new names coming in. And that's a normal process in a way. And you'd know by some of the names that they're very recent, something like the pump field, is unlikely to be very old, But then you get names, Irish language names, which, can't have been kind of invented after the shift from Irish to English. So that means they're probably at least 100 to 150 years old in County Westmeath, maybe a little bit older in some cases. The larger farms which have stayed in the same family will be very conservative. You know, the names don't tend to change if you don't have a change of ownership. Sometimes they will survive as well, even when you do have a change of ownership. Looking at a couple of farms in my own area where there were large farms which were basically sold in the 1930s, 1940s, when a lot of old estates and so on were broken up and were bought by local people who in some cases would have worked or would have been former tenants on the estate, and a lot of the farm workers stayed the same, and the names have survived because of that, because there wasn't any sudden break. So, and sometimes you find even farmers who buy a neighbour's farm, they'll get to know all the names and they will survive. Sometimes they won't. So there's a lot of variation there. It depends, but it's perfectly normal for names to come in and out of use. Now, this is just an example of a sheet filled in. So in the black there, this is the volunteer has filled out the name, and then I've come along at the meeting and just documented the actual pronunciation using a shorthand, a phonetic shorthand, just to get the pronunciation exactly as it is. So Therlene is Therlene, Maddox Island is actually Maddox Island, is how they say it. Bawn is pronounced Bawn, and so on. It's simple enough. It's called the IPA. It's just a simple way of documenting pronunciation. Sometimes I record the names on my phone as well, especially Irish names. So that's how it works. Now, handling the names we collect, this is I suppose where I come in. So we try and make recordings of Irish names, which probably 5 to 10% of the names we collect in Westmeath are Irish. Might be a bit higher in other parts of the country. Some people think that's low. I was really surprised how many there were, many Irish names. In every area we've gone into, we've found Irish names. There's been no exception there. They're a small proportion, but they're always there. And I think that's quite remarkable considering how unlikely it is for a field name, regardless of its linguistic background, to stay the same over a period of time when you consider there's so much change in land ownership. And people tend to think of changes in land ownership as being something recent, but it's not. When you talk to people, and I've been in so many meetings and talked to so many people, lots of families have moved from one part of the parish to another. The Land Commission generated a huge amount of changes in how land was organised. There are a lot of areas where people would remember, in the 50s, 100 or 200 acre field, which is now, 20 or 25 different fields when it was divided up with the Land Commission and so on. So there's been a lot of change all the time. And then you go back further, there was a huge amount of enclosure where, the fields that we see now were actually, the ditches were sown and so on in the 18th and 19th century. So there's always been a lot of change. Surnames, really important. I don't know if you're aware, but if you look at most Irish surnames, the effect of the change from Irish to English as the majority language has kind of played havoc with surnames and how they've developed. And lots of surnames have become confused and conflated with each other. And often the written form of a surname doesn't equate to how people pronounce it locally, or sometimes there are 2 or 3 different ways of pronouncing the name locally. One way that might be considered a bit old-fashioned, another way that's current, and maybe another way that only maybe people who have moved into the area would use. So that can come up in field names, and it's very valuable for helping us to understand maybe what the actual origin of a surname is, the real original form, rather than something that's been confused with. And then of course names whose meaning is not obvious. We come across ones that are just not clear. Are they Irish? Are they English? Is it some English dialect word? Have they become kind of corrupted over time? So we record them and have a look at them later, and we might be able to figure out what they are. Publicity then, of course, is always important. So I think I see Seamus and Dara and Nora here. So we did a bit of recording for RT Radio for a programme called The County Measure with Vincent Woods. It was very enjoyable, hour on a nice sunny day, at a place called Loughnafullah in Sheenless in Ballymore. Hopefully lots of people will have tuned in and heard that. It was on the morning, it was broadcasting at 10 in the morning, so a lot of people should have heard it. And it's on the player, and we talked a little bit about what people got out of the project from participating. People, I think that was what really came from it. And there was a range of voices there, from how people contributed and what they felt they got out of the project and what the value of it was. Now, some names we've collected recently. So that's kind of the introduction, and now I just want to look at some examples of what we've collected. So, three areas in particular we've worked in this year. So, Ballymore have been on the go for a couple of years, and we had an additional 93 names collected in June 22 from Ballymore, Collestown, Newtown and Killinboy townlands. Just a couple of examples. I'm mostly going to talk about Irish names. I think I gave a talk for Heritage Week last year where I talked mainly about English language names and English dialect words. I'll mention a few of those this year, but mostly I'm going to be talking about Irish names. Typical one would be bogon, which is soft ground. Probably actually that word bug may have been borrowed into English and given us the word bog, soft place. It's possible. It's beside the Dungalman or Tang River. Looking at the soil map, it's Lake Alluvium, so soft soil, no surprise there. There's another example of bogon in Nuttall and Tang, just beside the old grade there, the Nuttall there. And I think we have a few other examples of bogon from different parts of the county from memory. It's a fairly common one. Okay, so we have it as the bogon or bogon and so on. Now another interesting one that came up, and this one's interesting because this name has already been recorded, but then it came up again in our survey, and it actually only kind of fully came up at the meeting itself when we started talking, and a little bit more information came out about the name. So this is an example of field names collected from Ballymore area in 1937-38 as part of the school's folklore collection. Are people familiar with the school's folklore collection?
Yeah.
Docus.ie. I think most people have had a look at it. If anybody here that isn't, I can say a little bit about it. It's an incredibly useful resource. One of the best things ever done, I think, really, because it was such a widespread all over the country, except unfortunately not in Northern Ireland, which is a terrible, terrible miss. And actually they were offered the opportunity to take part, but they didn't want to. Although they did a smaller survey later in the 1950s. But the changes of the Second World War and technology, you wouldn't ever get the same richness of tradition, I think, at a later period. So this one, Ryan's Shop. So this is the first time we got the word shop in the field name in Westmeath, to my knowledge anyway. I'm sure there are more out there that we haven't collected yet. And one of the kind of points I try to make talking about field names is that what they reveal is a special vocabulary for describing the landscape. And it's a vocabulary which is specialised and specially developed for the local landscape, and that's what makes it so interesting and so valuable. And you just won't get those words, you won't get that depth of understanding by looking at a dictionary or whatever. It's when you see them applied in the landscape that you get an appreciation for it. And it's also one of the losses probably of the language shift in a lot of areas, that we don't have that. It's more difficult to describe those particular features maybe in English because somehow it doesn't quite fit. These words were in common use and were very well matched to a particular landscape feature. So a shaw, it's a holm or a river meadow or a valley bottom. You're essentially talking about a wetland, and you usually have some kind of stream in it, and it occurs in place names all over Ireland. There are loads and loads of them. And as I said, this is the first one we got in the field name. It was written as Shrock Field, S-H-R-O-C, which is a fairly good attempt at how it's pronounced. It's Shrock. And it's in the townland of Newtown, and it was apparently full of red sedge, which is a type of grass which grows in wet ground in the past. The spelling was S-H-R-I-G-H in the school's folklore collection. So you can see here now that different spellings, you know, could lead you astray fairly quick if you didn't know what you were doing with regard to interpretation. And getting the local pronunciation and talking to people, very, very important to get a definite profile of the name. And then what I do is I will look at the place names database of Ireland and look, well, are there other examples? And there are. And then you look at the landscape and you say, okay, this is very clear what this is. This is a very ordinary, normal place name following the pattern of this special topographical vocabulary, special set of words which are used, you know, to describe features in the landscape. So it's, you know, I want to adjust that. It's this field here. Picture quality isn't fantastic on the map, unfortunately, on the right, but the aerial photo is pretty good. So you can see the one outlined here, and you can see the different old water courses which have probably been drained now, running through it. And talking to one of the volunteers, Joe Sloan, you know, it said there used to be a mass of kind of great, of red sedges and you know, different grasses that grew in wetland. It's being drained now. And so it's basically a little river running through it, joining the river stream then on the left hand side. On the map, unfortunately the image isn't great, but you can see there's a spring marked there. Just about make that out. It's a spring, and there's a few other streams in it. So that's a Shroff. And I'm sure we'll find more Shroffs in different parts of Westmeath. People here are even aware of other examples that we haven't recorded. Moving on now, see Seamus is here. I think you collected this one, I'm not sure. So this is, you know, Croch na She. It's pronounced Croch na She, and spelling would be Knoch na She. Hill of the fairy mound. A she is a fairy mound. A very common word in place names. Loads of examples all over the country, and this pronunciation of Knoch as Croch is nothing unusual or particularly remarkable. Connacht Irish and Donegal Irish, in the case of both of those dialects, basically the Irish that is spoken on a line north of the Galway-Clare border, maybe draw a line across Kildare, maybe as far as Wicklow, or a little bit less certain in Leinster. In general, the word Croch was pronounced Croch in all those areas. So it's perfectly logical that we would find it pronounced that way in Westmeath. And again it comes up that way. It's Crochán and so on. Now sometimes you get Knockán as well. And even today in the Connemara Gaeltacht in Cusharga area west of Galway, some people say Knock and some people say Croch. Okay, so it's a normal development. And it's not just that word, it's gnaw and raw and so on. Okay, really nice and interesting to see that reflected in a local place name in an area where the language is no longer spoken as a community language. But here we get an example of the living language rather than the written or standardised language, which is really, really important. And very important, I think, from the point of view of people's relationship with the Irish language, because its position in the education system and also this idea of the Gaeltacht can lead people to believe Irish belongs in certain niche areas of life but isn't a part of general life. But then when you see the local forms and the local pronunciation of small little local areas like this, you realise that Irish kind of underlies the culture we have in this country in every place. Okay, and place names are maybe the strongest manifestation of that. And it's okay. Now, talk about this name specifically. Croch na She. Now, according to how it was collected, it's located on the spot height, 261 feet high. This hill here, I think, in Collestown. And looking at archaeology.ie, there's a mound recorded to the north of this hill in wetland. So I'm not sure if it originally referred to that or if it originally referred to this hill or there's something going on there, but it's interesting that there's an archaeological feature. And then, if we look at the school's folklore collection, there's the hill from the road, I think, Seamus, I'm not sure. That's the one there, yeah. And it's kind of prominent, you know, so you can see why people would, you know, call it something like Croch na She. And, you know, there are famous ones in medieval literature, I'm not going to go into it, loads of of the old Irish tales, you know, are set in a she, where you would have, you know, Bodolph was the king of the she of Munster and so on, and all sorts of interesting things would take place within the she, sort of an underworld place. So you can see there it's quite prominent, and you can see why you would get the name Croch na She. And as I said, there is a monument nearby. Now, we have another Croch na She recorded very close by, and I'm wondering, are there two different Croch na She's, or do we need to fine-tune the location? So this is Ryan's Shaw down here, and in the school's folklore collection it's written Croch na She. Don't worry about the DH, okay, that's just the older spelling system. And it's said to be on Thomas Ryan's farm in Newtown. But here we have two ring forts, so you know either of those could be Croch na She as well. So there may well be more than one Croch na She fairly close to each other. I'm not sure. We need to look at that one a bit more. And it's only when I sat down to look at the folklore collection I realised, oh, that's a bit interesting, you know. But certainly that one there, that Seamus that you collected, it's so prominent you could see why it would be called Croch na She, the one in Pallistown. So there may be more than one. And it's a very kind of legible name, you know, it's very clear what it means, and I'd say it's fairly common. Okay, now moving on from Ballymore to Boher. I don't know if anybody from Boher here. Boher's what you might call a chapel village. This is a term geographers use to describe. They're probably the last kind of urban settlement to develop in Ireland before kind of modern times, we'll say. And they're usually centred around a church, late 18th, 19th century. Sometimes a school would have been built there later, then you might get a GA pitch, sometimes a shop, but they're generally centred around village, and they're centred around a church and parish or a half parish. And sometimes there'll be very little housing, you know, you don't see a street there too often. Boher's typical example of a chapel village in the civil parish of Kildare, and it's the Catholic parish of Ballymore and Boher. Okay, between Ballymore and Streamstown, I don't know if people know it. And Boher, pretty obvious what Boher means, I think for most people, it's just a road. And there are other examples of Boher around Boher in Limerick, Tipperary, Cork, and Wexford. But the Boher in Westmeath is not in Loganham.ie, and it's not on the Urban Survey maps either, which, as people said to me locally, Boher doesn't exist, which annoys people locally. So I'm going to see if I can get that changed and get it into the database, because it's actually quite an important place name when you have a school and a church and a whole community that uses that name. And even I think there used to be a football team years ago, yes, for a while anyway. Yeah. So that's Boher. So looking at the name itself, I got curious then when I said this isn't documented at all, it should be documented. I looked into the records, and there's actually a mistake there. See where it says 1908, that should be 1808. Okay, now that's the earliest reference I found to the name. Now that's pretty late for something like this, so this suggests to me it was really only probably when the church was built that this place became important enough to be noticed. I mean, that's not to say the name Boher didn't exist before, I'm sure it did, but it might have been just a very local place name, like the kind of names we collect now. But when the church was built there, the Catholic church was built there probably in the 18th century, it became a little village, so to speak. It's mentioned in Larkin, on Larkin's, that's the grand jury maps of the predecessor of the county council, was the grand juries. They looked after the kind of maintenance of roads and all sorts of different things. And it's on that map, and then it's in Leach, which is sort of a directory. Leach's directory mentions every settlement in the country, practically, every place there was a postal service and so on. 1814. Westmeath Independent, the earliest reference I think is 1807. Or sorry, what is that? Couldn't be 1807, Westmeath Independent. It must be 1870. And then Boher School, it's on the Ordnance Survey map, folklore collection, and then the local pronunciation. Now, looking at the earliest two forms, it's Boher Gloss there, and that's pretty clear. It's Gloss, which is Irish for green or grey. Okay, it could be either. this is not in Beaufort, this is actually the Sweep Road near Glasson, near where I come from. And you know, perhaps the road at Beaufort Church looked like that at one time, and you could see how somebody would call that Beaufort Gloss. Now, gloss can also refer to a grey colour, and you know, grey gravel road could work equally well. Okay, so I don't know if it's the green road or the grey road. If you're curious about colours, you know, colours, terminology for colours varies from language to language. And I think for people who are native English speakers, maybe it's kind of hard to understand why it is that way. But when you look at a lot of different languages, there's a huge variation as to what is precisely meant, the relationship between the word and what colour or shade of colour it exactly means. Particularly when you look at, you know, different language groups, different parts of the world, there's a lot of variation in appreciation of colours. And how colours were termed in Irish is quite different to English. Okay?
You mean like their glass is grey or green in different languages? Do they have the same name for different colours, or?
Yeah, there's just a lot of variation in how people even appreciate it, you know, the colour. This kind of basic colours are often similar. I mean, I don't want to get into kind of I'm not an expert on the science of it, but you know, they're the primary basic colours. Things like black and white tend to be the same. But then you look at other colours which are actually combinations of other colours, you know, to make that colour. There tends to be a lot more variation. People appreciate it in a different way, you know. Red is usually red, you know, and black and white usually similar. But then you get into the kind of secondary colours, I don't know if that's the correct term, there's a lot of variation. So it's perfectly normal, I think there's nothing that unusual about it. That's Beaufort Glass. Not used locally as far as I know, just call it Beaufort. So 2 meetings in Beaufort so far, and we've 51 names collected from townlands of Kildare Church, Bishopstown, Ballydavin, Creve, Killay and Clydeglass. So we look at some of the examples. The first one is the Suline. Just check on the one for time. Okay. So this is from the boundary of the townlands of Creve and Killay, which is also the boundary between Streamstown and Beaufort parishes. And it's a small stone aperture or culvert which carries the stream under the road, and the whole area around that is generally known as the Suline. So it's not just the name of the bridge, that area is known as the Suline. And I don't know if you can see here, you see there's 2 little black marks there, almost like 2 little ellipses. So that's just showing that there's a bridge structure there, and that's from 1837, so it's a fairly old feature. And the stream actually only rises, you know, 50 or 100 yards to the east of the road, and then it flows under the road, and 2 more streams join it, and it becomes a larger stream. Now, we have another example of this name in Tang, and I don't know if it has the same type of culvert. I don't know if you're familiar with those culverts. If you get down in the ditch, sometimes you might see one. There's a lot of them there, only they're kind of hidden on our farm. Or was, at least, the road was kind of changed around recently. There was one every 150 yards on the road, and there was a little stone arch which carried field drains basically under the road. There's one right beside my house, that's why I'm familiar with them. And we have another example instead of Suline and Tang for a stream. Now it's applied to the stream there, but maybe it started off as the name of a bridge over the stream. Also there's examples in Meath. I think one leads near Summerhill, and there's one in Cranham or Scannon, which is just beside Summerhill, just outside Athlone. And you can see Soul, your eye, an opening, and that's essentially what they look like, is a small opening to allow the water to flow through. This is the bridge over the Suline stream in Tang. It's just a little tiny bridge. It's a little small river about 1 mile long, which joins the Tang River. So it's a really interesting one, and really interesting that it occurs in other examples. You know, but we only had about 3 or 4 in the folklore collection, and now we've added another one from our work, our field work, which is taking place today. What's 1937? Is that it's 8 years ago now? So it's still valuable to collect now. People often think of that as a golden age, that was the time to collect, but we're still collecting stuff now. from the oral tradition. So that's really important to mention that. I need to find out if that name is still in use locally, and I have a local contact, so hopefully I'll get to do that before the summer's out. Now, another really interesting one, maybe from an archaeological perspective, is this one, Atty. It's in Ballinavon, although the person who collected told me that the neighbouring town, which is called Culleru, a little small part of that cross boundary is also called Atty. And it's just an area of farmland. There are no houses in there now, and they call it Ballinavon Atty and Culleru Atty. And it's just an area, maybe 15 or 20 acres of land with no houses in it, known by that name. And I think this is T with the last part missing. Now that's a very common formula of name. There are at least 60 examples in townlands all over the country. I'll give you one from nearby, Castledaly, side north there. They have a townland called Atty, which is T Murta, which is the house site of a person called Murtagh. And you have T Mamish in Leitrim, which is the house site of Manus. Okay, so person's name, and then you have this formula T, the site of the house of. And sometimes it's not a name, sometimes it somehow describes the site or the house itself. Okay, and these are not recent names. I'd say they're of the order of 400 or 500 years old, up to 1,000 years old. So you're talking relatively early settlements. And what we have here is part of the name is missing. So it's just Atty. And the way it's pronounced, from kind of the training I have and being familiar with names, would suggest to me that the last bit is missing there, just with the way the stress pattern is. So people can ask me to go into that in more detail if they want. So it was probably something like T Hamish or T Rory or whatever, or something like that. And we look at the landscape evidence for it then, and you see the connection maybe, or how this could be useful to archaeologists, this place names evidence. So, unfortunately, the map is very faint, but you can just see the outline of an earthwork there, and at the moment it's being levelled now and you can barely make it out of the aerial photograph. And it is recorded on archaeology.ie, which is the archaeological survey, as a ring fort unclassified, and surface remains barely visible, and so on. But it may, and it's there as a ring fort, but it may not be a ring fort, it may be a later house enclosure. But we have now a place name to go with the very minimal physical evidence of what was there. So it's probably a medieval or early modern house enclosure. So I think that's actually quite an important result, which feeds into whatever people do. I'm kind of language and landscape person, and then archaeologists will be looking at these kind of features, which there are 40 to 50,000 townlands, and in a way a lot of them are similar to each other, but when you add a name to it, it becomes a lot more interesting. It's just a pity we haven't got the last part of the name.
Could it be that kind of like a homestead? Do you know the way family could have lived around the home area?
It's essentially it's an enclosed farmyard and house, probably, but a fairly old one we're talking about. So I want to look into that more, and I want to look at T whatever, T Rory or T Crowher and so on, those type of names, to see when were those names popular, because there were fashions in place names when a particular way of making a name was popular and productive. So we might get an idea then for when this site actually developed, or at least when it was named. Another one that came up, and this was one that is really interesting as well. Oh, map isn't great, but first map, I have to tell you what's there. It just appears as just an empty circle on the map, on the 6-inch 1913 map. Oh, that's the Cassini print, is actually 1930s. It's based on the 1913 map. So it just looks like a circle, and you'd say, what is that? It's unnamed, and you say that could be a water feature, that could be an enclosure, that could be anything. You don't know what it is. And I hadn't even noticed it till two people at the meeting kind of came to talk to me kind of at the end, you know, and we were talking about it, and that's often sometimes the most interesting names come up that way. And they both said they remembered that as a very, very distinctive feature. Said it was like almost a ring fort full of water. It had steep, except it had sort of ring fort in reverse. It had steep banks going down into it, and then another raised bank with stones on it, and then quite deep water, and they were warned severely to keep away from it as children. And the name was Love Dove, which is black hollow. And on the aerial photograph, it's barely discernible because it's, you know, with land reclamation and so on. And the land in this area was very rocky and very kind of rough. You can see the kind of dappled landscape, and the whole area there around those townlands in Boher was very rocky, and I'd say would have been quite wooded at one point. So this was the Love Dove, very important feature in the childhood of the people at the meeting, which to someone looking at a map or someone walking that field or looking at the aerial photograph is completely invisible until we record it and interpret it and collect the information and make it available. And it's a very simple name in and of itself. It's a very curious feature, the description that they gave to me of it. As to what it was for or how it came about, I don't know. And it's not on the first Ordnance Survey map at all, which is really, really unusual. So are we to take from that that Irish was still sufficiently alive for a feature was created after 1837 to be named in Irish? Or was it simply missed on the map? I think it's probably more likely the second one, but hard to know, because that area is so rocky and rough. Then, you know, Ordnance Survey were focused on the most valuable land. It was a land valuation exercise ultimately. Maybe that got missed for some reason, or maybe it was such an unusual feature we weren't sure how to represent it. I don't know. Okay. Another simple enough one from Boher, Finn's Cooleen. This is in Clydeglass. And a cooleen is a very common word in place names. It just means a nook or a corner. Now it can mean other things as well, but I'm pretty sure that's what it means here. It's quite a big field, and then you see the kind of small corner, and that's the area of the field that the name applies to. Okay, and Finn is probably a surname. There are quite a lot of Finns in that area. I looked at the census and there's plenty of them, so I think there's no doubt about it. That's Finn's Cooleen. The other one that came up, and this one hasn't even been officially recorded, but in the chat at meetings, sometimes people come and they mention names and then they don't come to the next meeting. So I usually write those ones down. And this one came up, the Pool of Mulla. I don't know if people know the road. If you drive from here to Kildare, the Ocean Inn, take a left and then take a right just after the graveyard and follow that road that brings you to Boher, essentially. And you go up over very high land, and there's this strange kink in the road. And just after the kink in the road, when you're at the very top, it's actually a great view if you get out of the car. It's up at, I don't know, it's 480 foot, so 146 metres, which is relatively high for Westmeath. You have this high, flat level area, and a pool formed there in the relatively recent past, I think maybe in the last 40 or 50 years. Water laid there for a substantial number of years, and the name developed the Pool of Mulla. But Mulla must have been the older name for that area, and Mulla is Mulla, which is somewhat or hilltop. So in that way the name survived, possibly because that pool of water, which apparently has since dried up, or I have it in one area photo, but apparently most areas it's not there. Okay, so that's the Pool of Mulla. Now, Scahon. Maybe somebody can help me out on this one. I know there was a walk recently with an archaeologist at Conacosta or Crockashta, which is the large hill in Rosemount, and one of the most impressive hills and archaeological sites in Westmeath. I don't know if people are familiar with it, Crockashta.
That was on the walk last
Yeah.
year.
So it's a really impressive hill from any approach you take to it. So this is Crockashta down here. And a field name that was collected from the Boher group is Scahon, and that's exactly how it's pronounced, as it would be in Irish. And Scahon can be, well, it usually means a mirror, but Scah is a shadow, so it occurred to me a little shadow if you could, it's a hill, it's quite a high hill, open hill, doesn't seem to have ever been, there was some field boundaries, a bit more than is there now, but it always had quite large open fields. And it's 473 foot, and Crockashta, which is almost exactly a mile southwest, is a bit higher, so it would have been overlooked. So the man who collected it, he had the idea maybe that Crockashta would cast a shadow on it. I don't know if that's possible really, I don't think it's high enough. You can get a shadow from clouds. I don't know if you've seen that. You know, you can get a shadow on a mountain from a cloud, and there's a cloud in the way. That's a common thing. And if it's sufficiently open, you might see a small shadow, and maybe that would happen regularly. Another idea I had was, like that pool of Mulla, you do get pools of water that form for a couple of years, and it might just catch the light from the higher ground in the winter when you have very low angle of sun, and that's why you might call it Scotland mirror. So I think it's a shadow or a mirror, it's one of the others, I can't, that sounds very vague, I know. But it's one of those. So that's Scotland. And again, that's not written down anywhere that I know, and it's just the farmer himself who knows it. Now, same man gave me this name, Capahala is how he spelled it. And this is at Kildare Cross. So, if you take a left, going from here at Kildare, head down to the graveyard, and it's this block of land here. This is Capahala, and it's a lovely bit of land, hasn't been kind of over reclaimed or, you know, hasn't been changed that much, I'd say, for a long time. And he said it's one of the best fattened land in Ireland, and seems to be, he doesn't own it, so he's not boasting. It seems to be Tapach and Chala, the tillage plot. Tapach is a tillage plot, a very common word in Irish place names. And Chala, then, you might have heard of the Shannon Callas, you know, the lowland on either side of the Shannon. You go south of Athlone, you have the Shannon Callas running all the way to Banagher. That kind of land. In Limerick, then, where I work, you have Castle Troy, which is actually Cala and Troy, and that's the same word, Cala, and you have a lot of similar land. There's land that floods very often. You would have been used for hay meadow mostly. But I think that's the Cala there. There's a river running through, or a kind of a small stream through the middle, and the town, the fields actually there, it's this shape that actually just slopes into the river. Now I think on this aerial photograph there are all tillage ridges, but I looked at a few aerial photos and it didn't show up in others. But I'm pretty certain from looking at it and looking at the field that it's not, you know, mowed hay or anything like that. It's full of rocks. You couldn't mow it, okay? So I think they may be old tillage ridges, and it would have been ploughed, you know, by hand or, you know, using a spade or with a horse, where you would have avoided the rocks, you know. So it's quite an interesting bit of land. So that's used to stable the horses in Bianconi's day, you know, the coaches. There's a shed just there. So I mean, there's a lot going on there. You have a school then here, an old school, which is
that's St. Bridget's Well at the top left.
So there's a lot going on there, you know. So this is actually an important discovery, I think. So more to do on that one, I think. So that's Capahala, tillage land of the Cala. That's another view of it there. You can see it slopes in there, and you see how you couldn't mow that too easily. And that word Cala itself has been borrowed in English and is used extensively now to describe, you know, land that floods regularly, floodplain land. And it's part of a kind of series of words, Esker and Drumlin and Machar, which are used by scientists today and geographers, which all come from the vocabulary of Irish place names, which I think is really interesting, those words that come into English from Irish. Okay. Now, I know time-wise I'm probably behind a bit, so I'll finish up now on the next two slides. Sometimes collect from individuals. A couple of weeks ago I was talking to a 96-year-old farmer who's the second oldest man in Cloverclare parish. Pat Keegan is the Hillen, and his father worked for the Smiths of Portlick. And I know there was a really interesting series about the big house recently, and the Westmeath Heritage Office was involved with. And he had some interesting kind of memories of that from his father. And really there aren't that many people left now with a connection to that estate because it's been broken up for a very long time. I know that there were a lot of records from that estate that existed in the 50s because the National Library documented that they existed, but I don't know where they are now, maps and rentals and so on. And he had about 20 names, some from Portlick and Winnion, which was the Smith lands, and then from other areas around. And briefly, just look at, and this is in state ownership, it's county council owned, and you know, lots of people walk there and probably could benefit from more signage, you know, of this kind. I think there's going to be some work done in Portlick, so it might be an opportunity to include, you know, more information on place names. Now, this is not all the place names because I've collected others from other people in that area, but it's some of them. So you have the big wood, Quigley's houses. When you walk, I don't know, has anybody walked in the woods in Winnion? It's a nice place to walk actually. As you go down through it, you'll see substantial stone walls in the wood, and they're the remnants of a little village essentially, which seems to have been cleared around the famine. That's known locally as Quigley's houses. Now that'd be pretty well known. There's the remains of quite a number of houses there, and they've only become wooded in the last 150 years. It was open land at that time. You have the Point Field, pretty obvious why that's called the Point Field. You have the Mochine, which is an Anglo-Norman motte, beside an early church site. This is here, it's pronounced locally Mochine. You have the Rock Road, which is the other public access point to Portlick. It's by the Scout Centre, that's locally known as the Rock Road. You have Corngating, which is a little village, totally nothing gone, there's nothing left now, just outside the Smith lands, which existed up to around the famine time as well. And this one here, the Toper Gate, when you walk at the back of Portlick Castle, which was recently sold actually, there's a very obvious stone raised causeway. It's about 2 metres high, and water from Lough Ree comes in either side of it in winter. And for years I said that's definitely a toher, it must have been called a toher, but nobody seemed to know it locally, so I finally found someone who said, oh yeah, the back gate of the castle there, that was the toher gate. Okay, last two from him then, toher's a causeway. The Loch Park and the Bog Park, I think this must be the Loch Park. I don't know if you can see that, it looks like a drained lake there with a drain running through it. And Bog Park, I know that one myself, there's a bit of bog ground, I think that's where that was. So he wasn't 100% on the location. Now, 2 minutes to finish up on other work we've done this year with the project. We've had somebody looking at the school's folklore collection systematically, and they have taken or exerted out 1,500 field names collected in Westmeath, and they've checked half the schools so far. And we've another half to do. Some of those are not really local names, they're actually townwide names, and when we do those out, I think we'll end up with about 2,500 names which are on record. And then we'll be able to more easily compare what we collect to what's in the school's folklore collection when they're all together in one list, you know. So we've been doing that this year. There's a master student of mine, Sophie Levine, working on that. And why is this not going down? Okay, last bit, I've been looking at documentary evidence for field names around Athlone, and we have a lot of really good early sources for Athlone, and I think over time it's going to be possible to reconstruct the medieval field landscape around the town of Athlone, going back 400 and 500 and 600 years, because of the sheer amount of records we have, and a lot of that is built on now. So just a couple of examples. They come from various sources, I won't go into those. Acroquil is where I used to go to school. I used to stand waiting for the bus, I never knew it was in Acroquil. It's completely built up and there's no, the railway kind of obliterated the whole field boundaries there. It's the Marist College, as we used to call it, the Marist. People might know that on the Retreat Road in Athlone. That was Acroquil, Narrowacre. Acre and the Hopwisha then was one of the old glebe or church lands of the parish of St Mary's. That's between where the IDA headquarters and TUS, or Institute of Technology at Home, it's just a small field there. And then other interesting ones like the Brugger's Plot, I found that in a lease from the 18th century. That's beside where actually my an uncle of mine lives. It's now Retreat House. Okay, it's totally built up. Brugger's Plot, I'm not sure. maybe where there was geese or something reared